Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the psychological impacts of bearing witness to genocide.
The destruction or the suffering is so unimaginable on a scale that feels really impossible to grasp that the mind just sort of shuts down. And there's a lot of just like throwing up your hands and like, there's nothing I can do.
How one Palestinian-American writer and clinical psychologist grapples with displacement and trauma in her work. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
In you is the glittering Beirut pavement after rain, the ports of Boston. In you are both my grandmother's rebellious blood, following men escaping wars from one country to another, my mother's leavings, my aunts, the rage and humiliation and exile. In you is the harm and rejoicing and help of generations of women. In you live the people that made you, all of them. I wouldn't give you another story, even if I could, for this is the one that bore you, and it is heavy and dazzling and the truth. My name is Hala Alyan, and I'm a clinical psychologist, professor, and writer based in Brooklyn, New York. And that was an excerpt from my forthcoming memoir, I'll Tell You When I'm Home.
Hala, it is so nice to have you on The Take. Welcome.
Thank you.
We've just heard how you introduce yourself in one line, but we know from your writing and from your poetry that your identity is made up of not only what you do and where you live, but where your family is from and why they left those places. How does all of that inform your work?
I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's actually so ubiquitous, it's hard to even place it. I think even my relationship to language and storytelling and reading and writing is connected to exile, in that I learned English at the same time that I learned to read and write, because we had left Kuwait after the invasion and my parents had sought asylum in the States. So there's a way in which even my introduction to the English language was kind of connected to displacements. And by the time I was thinking about sort of what to specialize in and what to kind of do grad school in, I think clinical psychology made a lot of intuitive sense for me, because it in some ways picked up the thread of the things that I already loved about literature and already loved about poetry and storytelling, which is that you sort of, in therapy, people come in with fragments and your job is to sort of like co-pilot and help architect some sense of meaning and coherence and kind of like a whole out of parts. And that for me feels very, very similar to writing.
You have noted before that you were the daughter of a Palestinian father and a Syrian mother. And I wonder what that means for you today when those two places are so often in the headlines.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's this way in which the three countries that have been in the headlines really, at a heart-wrenching rate in the last year, more recently Syria, but certainly Lebanon as well. I spent high school and my undergrad years there. There's this bifurcation where you have a relationship with place and with land that's highly personal, even if you have not been there. For instance, I have never stepped foot in Gaza, but it's where my father was born. And so there is a connection there. But there is this dichotomization where you know a place intimately, either from your time on the land or through stories and like customs and rituals that have been passed down generationally. And then the split between that and watching how a place is portrayed via media, having to watch a place from your screen, watching what kind of language and what kind of qualifiers are used to describe that place and the people in that place. Who gets to be a civilian where, who gets to be a victim where, who gets to have a right to things like, equity or liberation or self-determination, how entire swaths of people and communities are talked about, how their slaughter is talked about. It's been a striking exercise in watching and at times experiencing cognitive dissonance to sort of know places that are just some of the most like culturally rich, vibrant, gorgeous places on this planet, and then watch how they're portrayed by powers that be is really, it's really gut-wrenching.
Compounding that gut-wrenching feeling, I imagine, is that you're watching, but you're watching from afar.
Yes.
This past year and 2 months have been filled with horrific images, videos, reports of constant death, constant displacement.
Yes.
As someone in the diaspora who works with grief and trauma, what has it felt like to bear witness from so far away?
I mean, there's a tremendous amount of, I think, helplessness. There's a way in which I always think of like concepts of psychic numbing psychologically, which essentially is what the nervous system and the mind does when we are just at capacity, when you are overwhelmed. I think there's a way in which that can yield a lot of feelings of survivor's guilt, a lot of feelings of, I think, just guilt in general, ineptitude, feeling just kind of powerless. And what I would say to that is it's actually really the brain's way of doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is shutting down in the face of the unimaginable.
Wow.
When things are beyond comprehension, when they are beyond capacity, your mind does not know what to do. Your nervous system, your ecosystem in general doesn't know what to do, because what you're watching is so relentless and the destruction or the suffering is so unimaginable on a scale that feels really impossible to grasp that the mind just sort of shuts down.
Hala, I understand the theoretical concept of that, but can you break that down to what that means? Are we talking about seeing the relentless bombardment of
exactly.
Palestinian people?
Absolutely, yeah. When you have
and not being able to do anything about
absolutely. So when you have an entity or an army or a government enact policies that are just like, they involve, you're talking about massacring people at an incomprehensible scale. I mean, it's just, again, you're talking about policy that really at its core operates on concepts, I think, of relentlessness, and operates, I believe, on a pretty intricate understanding of the human psyche in terms of things like psychic numbing, in terms of things like capacity and what happens when we reach our capacity as witnesses. And so I've come to just start thinking about the ways that we can collectively face relentlessness with relentlessness and combat relentlessness with relentlessness, and doing it from more collectivist perspectives, and doing it oftentimes by taking the lead of the things that we see from people on the ground. The concept of samud, which is vaguely translates to just steadfastness or rootedness. It's a very like Palestinian concept, and like how can we be steadfast and rooted in our solidarity, in our allyship, in our witnessing? How can we be like relentless in our allyship and in our commitment to liberatory practices, as relentless as practices of oppression? I think that's what the moment calls for.
Wow, that's a beautiful call to action and a beautiful way of looking at what this psychic numbing has felt like for those of us who are outside of Gaza and outside of these war zones around the world. Despite all of that, though, despite the countries of your childhood and your family's homeland being so far away, the horrors that we're seeing are really close up.
Yeah.
So we're not experiencing them firsthand, but we are secondhand in the palm of our hands via social media, on our phones. You're a practicing clinical psychologist. What are the lasting effects of seeing everything constantly on social media? And what happens to an individual when loss and grief is part of your everyday life?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways the nervous system breaks down. I mean, I think that it's where, you have things like compassion fatigue that kick in. You can have secondary traumatization. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the people that are on the front lines of organizing and fundraising, doing teach-ins, doing direct actions, et cetera, oftentimes belong to communities and belong to bodies that have themselves been policed and have themselves been, like, they're often the most likely to have already experienced trauma. So you're talking about kind of complex trauma and trauma that's being compounded upon through what we're all witnessing. Obviously, there's no, it has to be named that there is no experience of witnessing that can come near what is happening on the ground and what is happening to the people that are directly experiencing it. But that's not to say that, the most limbic and basic parts of our brain, when you are watching, a horrific video of somebody screaming for their mother, like a toddler, with burns all over their body, that part of the brain is not particularly sophisticated at filtering through what is happening right now in my Brooklyn apartment as I'm watching the video versus what is happening in the video. And so there's parts of our nervous system that are taking in these images, these sounds, these numbers, these kind of incomprehensible numbers of massacred, and don't really know how to distinguish between the fact that we're here and that's there.
Mm. So you are a writer and a poet, and our team asked you ahead of this interview if this past year had inspired new poetry. Mm-hmm. And one of the pieces that really stuck with our team is entitled Revision. It was published in Guernica magazine. Can you read an excerpt of it for us?
Yeah. Here are the rules. Here's my mother given name. Here's my small life. It is no more than any other. Here's my grandmother dead for 5 years. She's speaking again. She calls when I'm not expecting. Kif ibnik, she says. Where is he now? Let me say hello. What could I say back? He's good, I tell her. I pretend to call a child from the other room. I pretend to hear the sea from here. I wave back. Here are the rules. We bear what we bear until we can't anymore. We invent what we can't stand grieving. The sun sets on Gaza. The sun rises on Gaza, on your redaction, on your blue pencils, on your God-given eyes. He's good, I tell her. He's good. He's crawling. Mashallah, mashallah. Together, we praise the sea and the sun. Together, we praise how much he's grown.
Hala, thank you for that. It is quite striking to hear something so beautiful and to know that it came from a place of grief and trauma and pain. That's true talent. So thank you for sharing that with the world.
Thank you.
What was in your mind as you were reading and writing it? Where does it come from?
It actually, like the title Revision, it comes from a revision of a poem that I had written about my grandmother who had dementia sort of in the later months and years of her life would call to talk to a son of mine, and I've never had a son. And it just sort of began from there. And I was thinking a lot about the ways that memory is one of the things that's being targeted right now, that it's, one of the targets of the destruction has been archive. It's been cultural centers. It's been places of education. And just thinking about redaction in general and the ways that, we have been, what has been happening to language this past year plus, and what has been redacted and what is spoken and what is not spoken and what is policed and what's allowed to be said with what tone, out of what mouths. And so, it's kind of came from all of those.
More with Hala after the break. Well, Hala, you touched on the power of language and the use and misuse of it. So we've heard your beautiful words, but there are also words from various sectors of government who are making the decisions that lead to some of this grief we've been talking about. And what they're saying now is that after more than a year of hearing about stalled negotiations for a Gaza ceasefire, talk of that elusive deal is back on the forefront. So I wonder, from your perspective, what does it really mean to reach a so-called ceasefire deal now, after over a year of bloodshed, grief, and trauma?
I mean, listen, I think a ceasefire at any point is something that will be welcome. It is, as you said, a year and 2 months too late in many ways. And it's too late for the people that have already suffered immensely, have already lost their lives, have lost their homes, have lost the places of their memories and land. at the same time, anything that can stop and prevent future death and future slaughter is, of course, going to be welcome. So a ceasefire today is better than a ceasefire tomorrow. Having said that, I think at this point, there is a way in which so many have seen the complicity and the ways that our nation has funded what we have watched. And I think there are things that have been seen that can just never be unseen. A ceasefire, of course, is materially significant, first and foremost for the people on the ground, which is, we owe nobody, we owe no one more than what we owe people on the ground. And so in that sense, the only opportunity for any sort of life or breathing room or capacity for rebuilding, capacity for dignity, capacity for self-determination for Palestinians in Gaza is for the ceasefire to happen. And I think, the role in some ways of the diaspora, the role of the diasporic, of those of us that are of allies, of people sort of outside, is to think about ways to continue to hold people in power accountable.
Yeah. Hala, you mentioned that we've seen things that we cannot unsee. And my team and I, as we were preparing for this interview with you, a few people wondered aloud, how can I be under the care of Hala Alyan?
Okay.
And I wonder, and not even tongue in cheek, right? Because you have a beautiful way of allowing your experience and where you come from to inform your work, as we mentioned at the top of this episode, in a way that makes you understanding of people who would be coming to you looking for that type of care. So without getting into specifics, is this something that comes up in your clinical work with patients? And what do you do? What do you tell them? Yeah. What advice do you have?
I mean, of course it comes up. I think, many of the people that I work with and that I serve are coming from those parts of the world. There's a lot of people that are either immigrants or either immigrants or children of immigrants. And I think that there's a way in which really, the concepts of guilt, of what is the role of the diasporic, of how do we tolerate and rebuild our capacity continuously, and what is the role of somebody that's watching from afar? And from my perspective, it's to think of ways to continue to expand our endurance and to continue to expand our capacity for witnessing, for showing up, for acts of allyship, whatever they may be for each person, and that we are part of something larger than ourselves. Yeah.
Because in this case, existence is resistance.
Totally, yeah. Which is, the best proof of that is the concerted efforts to wipe out lineage. Yeah. I think when it's sort of the corollary, the answer to everything is in the destruction, right? It's the inverse of the destructive act. Oftentimes is like what needs to happen, and so if the destructive act is you destroy the archive, then the antidote to that is you recover the archive, you reclaim it.
Well, Hala, you brought up lineage, and that's where I want to end this conversation. I want to talk about birthing life in the midst of witnessing death. You have a memoir coming out in June.
Yes.
I'll tell you when I'm home. We heard you read an excerpt from it at the top of this episode, and it outlines the year before your daughter's birth.
That's right.
And you write about what it means to pass on your Palestinian identity to your daughter. So tell us, what does it mean for you to share and to preserve that identity, especially right now?
I mean, I think obviously in many ways the, stakes are as high as they could be. I think you just alluded to it earlier when you talked about existence being resistance. I think there's a way in which preserving, as we're talking about preserving the archive of stories or customs or music or language, preserving the archives of our bodies and preserving the archives of, my daughter, she's also the granddaughter of her grandparents, and she's the great-granddaughter of her great-grandparents, and she is somebody that is in part indigenous to that land, and there is no amount of obfuscation or fancy language or history tweaking that will change that. I think that at the end of the day, that is in some ways probably the most a difficult thing for people that practice oppression to swallow or to accept, is that to be Indigenous is to be Indigenous. It's kind of non-negotiable. And it doesn't matter whether you have access to a place or not, whether you are stripped of that access, whether you are able to cross the border. And so I think, for me, one of the things is really thinking about ways for my daughter, who's also half white, to be able to, I hope, have a vernacular and a rich enough vocabulary to be able to sit with those contradictions and to be able to sit with what it means to have elements of identity that are privileged. And that's not just about whiteness, or having an American passport, though that's certainly part of it. But I mean, I'm privileged here sitting and having this conversation with you. I'm privileged because a branch of my family tree made a particular decision to go to a particular place, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And it has meant that I have a very different life than I would have had they stayed. And so I think to be able to be emotionally and literally fluent in talking about privilege and talking about oppression and being able to, reclaim what needs to be reclaimed, in order to be able to be rooted in what our ancestors endured, so that we can have access to, so that it can be passed down to us. I think for me, one of the things I think about a lot is that when things feel unsurvivable, it's to really remember that we're all here because somebody in our lineage survived. All of us, Yeah. And so that is, I can't think of anything that's more of a birthright.
Oh, that is a beautiful place to end this conversation. Hala, thank you so much. I think about that all the time. The happenstance of who had to survive the Middle Passage in my case. And have the determination to keep going. Despite all of that. And that's The Take. Next week and the week after, we'll be bringing you our year in review. 10 episodes that shaped our year here at The Take. What stories do you hope we do more of next year? And what guests do you want to hear from? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this episode so more people can find it.